let's all give Nathan a warm Satanic Temple welcome.
Well, again, welcome. I'm so glad to have you all here. Big thanks to Satanic Temple, the fantastic crew who really do everything behind the scenes. This place is a bear to run. We just have a really wonderful group here. I don't know if you guys got a chance to be here during the day who make all this possible. So big thanks to TST and everyone working, and big thanks to y'all. So, unsurprisingly, what I want to talk to you guys about tonight are ghosts. Now, a word like ghost, of course, or the paranormal conjures up many different responses from many different people, especially at a place like TST, which is a hallowed hall of science and rationale. And some people might undoubtedly scoff and say there's no such thing as ghosts. They're just tricks of the mind. They're just sort of figments of your imagination. And I think what's so interesting, and what will be the crux of tonight, is to say that that is absolutely right. It is all your imagination, except so is this. So is every single thing you do, your friends, your job, your dog, your life. It's all figments of your imagination. It is the way your brain is processing and fragmenting and arranging all these crazy sensory, these billions of things happening all at once. When you put your hands on your lap right now, you're not feeling your lap. You're feeling the friction of atoms between them, and you're sensing that energy. You know right now, I don't see you and you don't see me, right? We see photons reflecting off each other, bouncing around this room. Our eyes are literally feeling this energy. There's no such thing as experience as a tangible reality. I mean, what there is just energy and our body's interpretation of it. Now, the hardest part of this, the hubris of humanity, is the assumption that what we can sense is what is real, is what is actual. In 2021, can anyone tell me what a Wi-Fi signal looks like? Can you see it right now? Can you see the radio waves? Can you see 5G? No, of course not, but they're very, very real. In fact, like they're so real, you could probably pull up on your phone right now and type in spirit photography and get a whole download of all this stuff faster than I can even say it. It's tangible even if you can't see it. And I think of this building. I know some were here last night, I already said this, but this building, which for the better part of a century was a funeral home. Where I am standing right now is where for almost 100 years there would have been a pastor or a priest or a loved one delivering a eulogy. This area right here, for 100 years, would have been where the bodies were laid out. This area where you guys are sitting, this is where mourners sat for 100 years in this spot. Does that change at all your perception of this room? I mean, of course it does, right? Like, we understand that there is just this intangible tangibility about everything. That experience and energy affect a place, a person, an idea. And when you're sitting here tonight, and you kind of feel a cold chill, is it death's hand, 100 years old, coming to greet you? Or is it just drafted, because it is kind of drafted here. So we have records of people experiencing and talking about the paranormal for as long as we have records. I think undeniably, I won't say every, but nearly every single culture has an idea of what happens after you die. Almost every single culture has some sort of facsimile of it, that this thing, this kind of liminal world between places exists, that the dead can come back to life in some way. We think of even like the Epic of Gilgamesh, which we all know, like Enkidu, who's really coming back from the grave. Sorry, just 1 second. Perfect. Right in front, good seat. But we have notions, yes, the Epic of Gilgamesh. I mean, one of the main characters is confronting ghosts in this story, some of the oldest writing that we have. I don't know if you talk about Native American cultures and First Nations and Aboriginal cultures and Indian cultures and Chinese cultures and, of course, like, obviously the Egyptians. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the Egyptians pretty much invented death. Or at least they perfected it. One or the other. I think they did pretty good. One of my favorite stories is perhaps like the first quintessential ghost story. This is the one that's got all the trappings of what we know of ghost stories today. It was written by Pliny the Younger, who's a 1st century Roman author. And it's a really cool story. You can read it all online. I won't do the whole thing for you, but I'm just going to read a little paragraph to kind of get you in the mood. I mean, it's Halloween soon. So, there was in Athens a house, spacious and open, but with an infamous reputation, as if filled with pestilence. For in the dead of night, a noise like the clashing of iron could be heard, and if one listened carefully, it sounded like the rattling of chains. And at first the noise seemed to be at a distance, but then it would approach, nearer and nearer and nearer, and suddenly a phantom would appear. An old man, pale and emaciated, with a long beard and hair that appeared driven by the wind. The fetters on his feet and hands rattled as he moved them. And that's paragraph 1. The story goes on. It really is pretty incredible, and you probably know the story. The story is there's this house that's super spooky and haunted. No one can stay in it except for one brave guy, in this case a philosopher named Athenodoros, decided he's going to stay the night in this place. And of course, as he's there this first night, he hears the fettering of chains, and he hears all the commotion. And it's kind of amazing in this story is he says, like, hold on 1 second, ghost. Like, I'm doing something right now. I'll get right back to you. And the ghost like shakes his chains like, come on. Interestingly, Athenodoros actually follows the ghost, and the ghost kind of leads him to a place, and he disappears. And of course, during the light of day, he digs up the spots and finds the body of a man. Again, this idea, it seems almost juvenile at this point when you think about it. But this is like crimson peak in Greek. Like, it really is this idea of the spirit coming back to kind of right or wrong somehow, and that the human, us mortal territories, need to fix it somehow in our planes. It's amazing when you really consider it. So I always want to share a bit about myself. I think we ask a lot of our guests when they come here, and I kind of want to have this be bi-directional. So I was born in Louisiana, and at the time, all my extended family pretty much lived there, though as a young kid, we moved off to Texas and then eventually abroad and all that. But really, this house is the epicenter for all this stuff. It's the reason why I'm here right now. It was my grandmother's house. My grandmother was just this, like, incredible woman. She, in 1920s Louisiana, was, she was everything. Like, she was an atheist, she was a Buddhist, she was a Muslim, she did all these different things, just kind of learning and studying. She even followed Edgar Casey, a little bit of spiritualist stuff, but this house was kind of like this almost this temple for me there too. And it itself had these incredible ghost stories. Like, supposedly, it was haunted by this woman in white, who was maybe an ancestor, maybe my great-grandma, no one really knew, but I always thought it was so funny that no matter what bed I happened to be sleeping in, that was the bed that she died in. That's what my cousins always told me. I never could figure out how that was, but this idea, this house that kind of held wonders. And that upstairs, you really can't tell, but it was completely decrepit. And as kids, we would dare each other to go up and kind of get to the back rooms as best we can and run back down. And if we were feeling particularly brave, we'd get into these trunks and we do the things that I know you've done before, which is you pick up these old photographs and these little relics from a time gone by and you start making up this story. You hold them close and you feel this thing and try to imagine like what this looked like on the person who was wearing it, or who had it before, real or fake. Just like this room, does it matter? I don't know. The experience is real, which is sometimes enough. I spent a lot of time in this house, and actually there it is. That is my great grandmother there. That's my actual grandmother there. My great grandmother built it.
And a dog.
And that dog, which I don't know the dog's name, which I wish I did. I spent a lot of time in this house, and like I said, my grandma was just this eclectic before that. I feel like that word existed. I mean, that's a silly thing to say. And in her house was really floor-to-ceiling books of two different types: the paranormal and art. And I feel like I'd find myself digging through, remember those great Reader's Digest, those big collections they had? Oh, they were so great. The Time Life books and all those things. I'd find myself going through those, and the same exact day, the same exact moment, picking up something about Van Gogh or Manet or Monet or whoever. This idea that the paranormal and the art were intrinsically tied, that they are both an articulation of the inarticulatable. They were this way to point at something that you don't really know what it is. Now, I don't remember if it was the warm kind of summer rain in Louisiana or not, but I do remember that my sister, my cousin, and I, we found a Ouija board in this house. And this is where all the stories start, right? It's always so good. This Ouija board was not that crisp, clean kind of Parker Brothers thing you see all the time. I remember being cracked and faded, kind of had voodoo symbols on it. I remember finding it in this closet, and it felt like I released it from this like dank sepulcher. Like it just felt like this thing, these bayou spirits came with it. I remember as a kid being absolutely entranced. And my sister, my cousin, and I, we started playing with it, and of course it starts moving around, and immediately it goes on N. And then of course it goes to A, to T, and it spells out my name. And oh my God, like this is the real deal happening. And it continues to start spelling out that it was actually one of our ancestors who was there to warn me of my impending death that night at midnight. Oh my God. So I remember like, oh, this is like the real stuff happening to me. So I remember talking to my parents about it, and they were like, this is ridiculous, but everything my sister said, no, we didn't touch this thing, it just sort of happened. And this was not uncommon for her, because I would never forget whenever we would have to, as your kid, you share rooms, she would always force me to sleep closest to the window, because when, not if, but when the boogeyman or the werewolf came, like, he'd get me first, and she'd have time to escape. But I'll never forget that night, lying awake in bed at 11:55, just waiting for that moment, just like Pliny the Younger, just like Athenagoras, just like in Kiddu, waiting for those moans from beyond, these chain drags to happen. I remember watching so carefully at 11:57, and oh man, hearing the creaks and pops, and here it comes, 11:58, here it comes. Oh my God, it's 11:59, and I'm sitting there watching wide-eyed. And it was 12 o'clock, and 12:01, and nothing came. I remember feeling so disappointed. And not that like I wanted to be killed by a ghost, but that I wanted to like see this thing that I'd been thinking about for so long, even at that age, like this thing that I wanted so bad to be real, and I wanted to see it. I feel like, well, it's the same reason you guys, again, I can't say enough, but it's Halloween and Salem almost. We've haunted ourselves. Like these ideas of these spirits existing somewhere else, they exist with us. I think like we project them, we manifest them. I mean, it's psychometry when we come to these really interesting ideas. That's of course what brings me here. What brings you here? I see a lot of people wearing like sharp black clothes and are in their 40s. Like, you don't get away from being enthralled by things that go bump in the night. And I found the board. So it's real. I didn't think it was real for the longest time. And I talked to so many of my cousins and my family about it. Oh, that's not true. And before my grandmother passed away, I was trying to like get her to recall the story. And she's like, that board? Yeah. And like any grandma house, there was just like cluttered junk. And next to the couch, kind of like this, you could imagine there were 15 million like Time Lives in there, Reader's Digest again, and like all this stuff. And this board just kind of comes out. Like, this is the one you're talking about? And like all of these things flooded back. And one of the coolest things in kind of like the here in Salem, did anyone go to the Talking Board Museum today? They actually have, not this board, because we still have it, but they have a copy of this board there. And that felt like completely serendipitous. Like sort of, we felt home here. But, why these stories are so important, why I wanted to tell you my story, because I know you have a story. Even at the TST, this idea that this is science, reason, and logic. There's no such thing as a supernatural. Everyone's got it, yeah, but there was that one time. And that time where things just kind of felt different, a time where you were walking down the road, maybe I should turn around, maybe I should turn the lights or do whatever. Like we've all sort of had these moments, inexplainable, paranormal. And I think that these kind of things happen personally and collectively. I don't need to tell you guys about the collective unconsciousness or anything like that. But this idea that we are kind of captive to each other. I'm wondering, like, during times of great strife, socioeconomic turmoil, if these kind of these events become either more common or we become more receptive to them. I mean, I think to a certain extent, it's much easier to imagine ghosts and vampires and devils, which we have a big 8.5-foot tall statue of devil over there, than COVID and your bills and all that kind of horrible stuff. Like, in some weird way, as horrifying as all these things is, like, it's more fun. It's a better nightmare than buying cat food, really. But it's this idea that, like, the other than this is a safe place, as well as a scary place. I mean, let's look at Salem. We live here, of course. We love Salem. Salem doesn't exist without this wonder and awe. You came here this weekend, or you live here, however, because something terrible and tragic and paranormal might have happened. And I know this idea, right, that like life never strikes twice, blah, blah, blah. Sure. Maybe not true. Who knows? But if I was, let's say, a lightning hunter, where would I start to look for that? I would just go to the last place I knew what happened, and maybe it can be a little bit closer by. I don't know, and I think that's what Salem is right now, and we want to kind of come rub up against that idea. Here's where I don't talk about the extreme prevalence of paranormal shows on TV, which I'm not even like I'm better than. We're going to go home and watch Ghost Adventures tonight. But these things, I think, really are a barometer for what we're looking to do, which is escapism. Of course it is. I think it's literally the Real Housewives of New York. We're here about a month ago. You can find it's pretty hilarious. They went to Crowhaven Corner and Hawthorne and all that. But this idea that even these shows kind of need to tip their hat just slightly to the things beyond. But now I'm going to talk about the thing that I hold near and dear, a true passion, which is spiritualism. Now, spiritualism is the belief that the deceased have the ability to communicate with the living through mediums. It's something that is certainly not unique to a time and place. It's like going back earlier, like every single culture has this idea of communicating with the other than the ghost or whoever. But in terms of modern American spiritualism, this thing that we know was started in March 31st, 1848. And I see some shaking heads. It's an incredible story. It's an American story. The story is these two young girls. And actually, there's always three. They never talk about the third. There's a cousin named Lizzie. But there was three young girls, but we'll just say two for the story. And side note about that, you always see these three, and you think they're the three young girls. One daughter, Leah, is like 18 years older than the other two. They never depict that way. Anyway. You have these two young girls, let's just say, who live in this house in Hyattsville, New York, which is about 30 miles east of Rochester. Later on, they would be called the Rochester Rappers because they're more signified in Rochester than a small little town. Who supposedly moved into this house and they began hearing knocks throughout, sometimes hearing voices, sometimes hearing all these things. The house itself, it kind of has a tragic history. So it was actually moved from Hyattsville to Lilydale, New York. Someone purchased the land in the 60s, built a new replica of it, and burnt down. The one in Lilydale burnt down too. So it's like this thing kind of can't stay alive. But without telling the whole story, the crux of it is these young girls sitting in a house just like this, not the exact one, but just like this. Paranormal things happening around them. And on this fateful night of March 31st, Kate, the youngest daughter, says, "Mr. Splitfoot," which is what common name for the devil. I can't think of how you right over there. "Do as I do." And she goes, and then she hears back, "Oh, perfect." And ha! Like there is the moment. The reason that date is said to be important because that was the first bidirectional communication. Then, little Kate says, Mr. Splitfoot, do as I do. And she goes, and just pantomimes it. And then hears back. And she says, look, Mother, it can see as well as hear. And this moment, this tiny moment, started an entire, I don't even want to say religion, I want to say a movement, a cultural movement that millions of people participated in. It is said this moment was so frightening that the mother, Margaret, the mother, her hair went white. And I wish I could tell you this entire story because it's an incredible story that kind of goes on and on. And this is almost like a proto-Hollywood story because these two young Fox sisters, they got chewed up, spit out, and everyone else made money but them at the end of the day. It's a crazy story. But from Hydesville, they go to Rochester. From Rochester, they go to Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, and start kind of touring as these magical spiritualists. This idea that they are in direct communication with the paranormal. Now, interestingly, again, if you look at the stories like the Bell Witch and all that stuff, there's so much that predates it. But for whatever reason, whatever moment was happening, these two girls are kind of accepted in a way that people hadn't previously been. Just 200 years prior, here in Salem, if you were anything other than the strictest of Christians, well, we know what happened. And I mean, we're not talking about like anyone actually doing anything devilish. Of course, there were no witches in Salem. There are people who didn't say their prayers just right, just perfectly. There are these ideas that, especially at the witch trials, that if they were going to hang you, they kind of gave you this trial that will string you up by your neck, and if you can say the Lord's Prayer in its entirety, you're definitely not a witch. But if you stuttered, if you coughed, if you did anything wrong, done. So something is happening in the American psyche with in 1848 when these women girls who would have been hung were heralded as oddities and and ushers of a new science, a new idea. It's interesting also to note that Rochester was a hotbed for reform and religious activity. It was home of what's known as the Second Great Awakening. And of course, there's a Protestant revival movement that was, oddly enough, being a TST described as a reaction against skepticism, deism, and rationalism. A reaction against this stuff. I think somehow it's more pure to be more believing. Very interesting. In the same vicinity, the Finger Lakes. Let me just say this real quick, because anyone here been to Lilydale? Oh, you gotta check. You can be there in 8 hours, honestly. You can be at the Hydesville site in 6 hours. It's really, really incredible. So like I said, the house was actually brought to Lilydale, burnt down mysteriously. All that's there right now is just this little marker where it used to be. And here's actually the site in Hydesville, and all you can see is the foundation. Oh, I won't tell you this whole story, but I'm going to tell you the story anyway. So, who the girls were hearing knocking around, they kind of gleaned, and they were able to find out that it was a dead peddler had come. And it was someone who had come to previous owners of the house. He had come and had been killed. There was a knife in the basement and all this kind of stuff. Oh my God. Supposedly they found bone fragments down there, and the girls were able to glean his name, which is Charles B. Orsnell, which you do see kind of reference C.B. Orsnell a lot. But right now, all that's left is the foundation. Now, what's real, what's fake? Is there a difference? In later years, they supposedly, and we're talking like 1900s, they supposedly did break out a sidewall of the basement and find actual human remains. So Miss Anatopoulos talked about doing some research down there. I was able to go down to Wayne County and look through all their records of research. Called the police chief, basically said, if you guys found a body, there should be a little bit of record of that, right? And of course, unfortunately, it was the 1900s. No one, maybe we had it on a piece of paper, maybe, but you can't quantify any of the stuff. But it's there. Okay, I can show it to you anyway. But this area, the Finger Lakes region, gave birth to Mormonism and Millerism, phrenology, the telegraph. Things are happening in this time, in this era, specifically in this region. We were starting to talk about galaxies, and the term dinosauria was coined. The photograph, which obviously we talk a lot about, the photograph is really coming into its own. If you think about Fox's 1848, the photograph gets patented in 1839. They're like simpatico, they're so one and the same. Electricity is coming into its own. These things are like flying all around us. Darwin, like they're happening at record pace. Every single time you would have opened up a newspaper, something new would be discovered. And you start to think like, would this have been so crazy to imagine if I can get power to my house? I can't see it, but I have light bulbs that are going on right now. If I could make a long distance phone call, you guys probably also know the first long distance phone call came out of Salem. If anyone ate at Turner Seafood, that's basically where it was. Really cool, yeah, so it's a fantastic place. Why is any of this other stuff so incredible? Like I think, you'll hear me talk about, so I've got no like big reveal for you, so I'm gonna keep it in the same point again and again. None of this stuff is a product of ignorance or stupidity. It is really about trying to open their ideas like what is possible and being more questioning of this. And you go back to that, in the Second Great Awakening, this idea against rationalism, like, what if? It doesn't seem that hard for me to believe. Even while I love this, even the term Pilsner beer, the Pilsner beer was actually patented about that time too. These, of course, are Kate and Maggie. It's a fantastic image. But it just must have felt like, again, every single day, something new was coming out, that we were on the brink of an enlightened age, that we were almost there. I have this great quote here. We talk about one who witnessed a session of the spirits wrapped to a popular song. He told a message, "Spiritualism will work miracles with the cause of reform." That a change was coming, heralded in by two teenage girls. One interesting point is that some of their first big supporters were Isaac and Amy Post, who of course are massive in the reform movement, the suffrage movement, the abolitionist movement, the temperance movement. This idea that they were kind of part of this cohort of change. And there really are reports of people communicating with the spirits and saying like better days are ahead. That I have gone to the future and I'm coming back to tell you if you do this and this and this, if we enfranchise people, that things can get better. I mean, it's got an incredibly noble thing. There's this really wonderful quote by this fantastic book by Barbara Weisberg called Talking to the Dead. And she says of this time, she asks the question, where are we going? Are our struggles moving us upward the social ladder? Or have our risks only pushed us down a notch? Is our society advancing towards utopian perfection? Or under new pressures such as urbanization, is it descending into chaos? Those of us who are women, will we stay placidly at home or step out into the street, into the labor force, into public life? Those of us who are enslaved, will we remain in bondage or march forward into freedom? Suffrage, emancipation, industrialization, reform, equality, egalitarianism, these were spiritualist ideas. Not ideas, but supports. Thinking about what this message was like in the Salem witch trials time, I think is so interesting that they would have not had this opportunity. And, at best, they had their detractors, of course they did, but they were still kind of seen as these oddities who could do this. I don't really know how or what. A lot of people didn't believe them, but they still were something. One thing, which I do think is kind of cool for anyone going on any tour guides coming up, ask your tour guide about mall pitching. So this is someone, about 100 years before the Fox sisters. And Mall Pitcher is one of our local kind of witches post-Salem. And you can see it's talked about like the Pythoness of Lynn. Supposedly she's actually born in Marblehead. And Marblehead comes up a couple times, which is cool. But this idea that she was, a real kind of quote-unquote witch. And you can still find these fantastic postcards about this home that she was supposedly, born in. And this is a different topic for a different day. But I would love for you guys just to consider this notion of the powerful powerless. That those who have low social standing have incredible spiritual standing. Salem I don't need to bring up again. If we look at like the main players, you have Tituba the slave. You've got these young girls in this highly patriarchal society who somehow are both powerless but powerful enough to invoke the devil. You look at the same exact language for everything from World War II. You have the powerless Jews who are just rats and nothing, but they are so powerful that they are like the cabal who runs the world. There's always these very interesting dichotomies that they want to do. And I think that this is time and time again an idea of you have this strength and you have that strength. And I think we kind of like the idea that you gotta have a dichotomy in there, but it's always this notion of the other. Now, I actually do have a little pet theory about why spiritualism was able to kind of progress in the way that it did. So, without saying too much, what's happening in America in the 1850s and 60s? War. We know everything, even about our famous, Revere's famous Friday, these kind of things, Longfellow. Like, they are trying very hard to write these very American ideas, these American poems to show us. Francis Scott Key and all these types of ideas, like, it really comes out again during the Civil War. Spiritualism was inherently patriotic too. And if you look at these fantastical documents you can find, very much involved with the prosperity of America. And I think there's this idea that because this was uniquely American, it got to be ours. It's something that maybe we could rally behind. Anyone here like art? No, probably right, they're all here. We know that maybe conspiracy theory, which is not a conspiracy theory, is the CIA fully backed the abstract expressionist movement. So we're thinking Pollock, Rothko, Hans Hofmann, all these people, like there was money getting dumped into these scenes as a reaction against communism and all this idea that we wanted something American that could be a part of the cultural scene. I think that's so much of why this was able to do it. That we could put our little feather on the cap of this. Now, don't tell anyone. It's very likely the Foxes were born in Canada. Don't get into that. Now we get to introduce our other character, which I think is so funny. The idea of spiritualism and photography as being bedfellows is just incredible. They were both at the time seen as kind of pseudo-sciences. Scientific arts are arts and science. Like it's this idea of kind of they're both. No one knew what to do with them. Our Salem hometown hero, of course, Hawthorne. For anyone read The House of Seven Gables, of course. There's a fantastic quote that I came across I just love, where Hawthorne is describing his character, Holgrave. And he says, "Oh no, I lost it. Oh, it was so good too. I had it and it was amazing." But anyway, Hawthorne talks about Holgrave by the age of 22. I'm just reading off the top of my head. By the age of 22, Holgrave had been a typist, a receptionist, a mesmerist, a photographer, a this, a that, and this. Like this idea that kind of lumped into all these little weird fly-by-night deals. Spiritualism, mesmerism, and photography, they're not that different, which I think is really cool. Now, photography has a incredible history. One of my things to always point out is that photography, even though it's right there, photography was not invented, it was discovered. What's that difference? What's the difference between invention and discovery? What does discovery imply?
It's already there.
It's always been there. The fantastic John Sarkowski says about photography, like an organism, photography was born whole, and through its progressive discovery of it, its history lies. Meaning, it is this elemental that exists somewhere, and we're kind of finding our little bitty bits of it. Now, just like spiritualism, the elements of photography have been documented, written about for as long as the same amount of time, as long as we've been doing stuff. The elements of photography will allow you to see me, and I see you, of course, we're seeing the photons, though. It was observed in every single era, from the first century in China to one of the fantastic scholars of the universe, I guess as far as we know, the world at least. Ibn al-Haytham, the phenomenal Islamic scholar, he was writing this book and he was thinking about the optics of the eye, optics of lenses, and the way that what we would call now a camera obscura works. And in his study, he's reading, he's researching, he's trying things, and he writes what was translated into Latin, et nos non inventimus ita, which I probably butchered, but supposedly means we did not invent this. This moment of him sitting there just like, this is bigger than me. This is bigger than all of us. I'll say again, this is an elemental force. It's not something I'm learning. I'm sorry, it's not something I'm inventing, something I'm learning. I think of our favorite guy. Who's this? Da Vinci, yes, thank you. Da Vinci, another scholar of what would become photography. The words were the same at the time. He was as well thinking about lenses, thinking about pinholes called camera obscuras, pinhole cameras, all that kind of stuff. In his journal, I don't know if this is a better quote, but it's still amazing to me. And you can see this in the Codex Atlanticus. It's written. Leonardo da Vinci writes, "O mighty process, what talent can avail to penetrate a nature such as this? What tongue will it be that can unfold so great a wonder? Verily none. This it is that guides the human discourse to the considering of the divine things." He's looking at this lens. He says, "Here the trees, here the people, here every part of the planet are condensed to a point. And oh, what a point so marvelous." That keeps me up at night. What an idea that somehow with the camera, we are condensing the entirety of our known and unknown universe down into a point, which would be the aperture of a lens, or the aperture in your eye. And it's all coming for our benefit, for our value. Now I could talk about this all night, clearly. But as we're moving into this notion of photography in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, it's showing us things that not only we couldn't see before, but that we didn't think were possible before. Ideas of microscopic images, ideas of galactic images, ideas of freezing time. So do you know that the basic speed at which a human can detect movement is about 1/60th of a second? That's frame rate, 24 frames per second. You guys have probably seen that stuff. What's interesting is the majority of photographs you take on a daily basis, majority, are things you did not see. Your camera is often photographing at 1/1000th of a second, 1/5000th of a second, whatever. You didn't see that. Your brain interpreted something like it, and the picture reminds you of it, but it is not what you saw. And even more so, if you're photographing less than 1/60th of a second, that is two of your entire realities colliding together into this image. The camera shows us things that you cannot see, like done with that. There's just no coming around it. Man, I love photography. Okay. Well, we're in the Victorian era. I won't talk about it. We're in the Victorian era. Again, photography is patented in 1839, but there are plenty of people who are working like, and I'd say the modern photography is patented in 1839, plenty of people working in it. Photography has had this interesting role of being the de facto truth teller. And I think we all know that, right? That if did it happen, did I get a photograph of it? Of course, we know that it's real. You know, I think it's interesting, like the forward track now, which is, is it real if it's not on Instagram or on Facebook or whatever? But this idea that somehow like, the photograph solidifies the reality. Now, the photography has never claimed to have the ability to tell the truth. It reminds us of the truth. It rhymes with the truth, perhaps, but it's not. I think of the interesting things that happened in art during these times. We probably know that, Impressionism, Pointillism, all these things were Expressionism, were direct results of the camera's really influence, because no longer did the painter have to be the person to paint the thing, paint the accurate thing. Now the camera can do it, so we can do whatever we want. I think of this image a lot. This to me is the most important image ever. What does this image depict? You can say it right out loud. Sleeping man.
Straw hat.
Straw hat. A dead man. Yeah, this image is called Drowned Man. And it was taken in 1840 by Hippolyte Bayard. Pretty cool name. 1840, Hippolyte Bayard. Drowned Man. What I forgot to tell you is that the full title is Self-Portrait as a Drowned Man. So you're both. This is potentially the first photograph to tell a lie, or to tell a story, or to represent a fiction in the form of a fact. This idea that photography does, we even talk about a lot of Instagram, blah, 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 but this idea that this thing that looks like a reality, separate from the reality, but why not? One can supplement the other. Photography is patented in 1839. This image is taken in 1840. For your own kind of information, this image was done as a direct result because the guy, Hippolyte Bayard, did not get the patent to photography. So he's like, you killed me, you killed my career because I didn't get this. Kind of a true story. Now I'm going to skip ahead to 18 years. This is an image by Oscar Gustav Rylander called Two Ways of Life. Anyone tell me what this image depicts?
A good time.
It is a pretty good looking time, huh?
Clothed and naked.
Good time. Does it remind anyone of a famous painting? Yeah. And even like Raphael's The School of Athens. So this image, which I kind of won't be able to do it, but you see kind of this wise sage in the middle, and then you see a guy to our right kind of hearing the call to a good time, which is drinking and sex and gambling and all that. And you see to y'all's right, I guess. You see study and piety and hard work and all this kind of stuff. And you know, the narrative is a little bit flat to our audience. This idea of depicting these two options for you. Now, it's probably hard to tell all this, but the two characters are the same person. So this image is created in 1858 of 32 individual glass plate negatives. This is so far beyond Photoshop. And I would wager to say in 2021, this looks damn good. It's pretty seamless. So in that era, they did these things called tableaux vivants, these living pictures. And it was actually very fashionable for you to go to a salon or to a friend's house, and you would see people in costumes, and they would kind of be doing their scenes and all this. And people like Oscar Gustav Rylander decided, like, let's put that in a picture. Well, I can't get everyone in focus because lenses were limited at the time. I can't get them all focused as one, so I'm going to take a picture of you and you and you and you, put them together, bam, there's my full image. Here's my hint. This predates spirit photography. Here's another image, because we're getting close to spiritualism now, spirit photography. This, I feel like, is a perfect bridge. And what does this image depict? Get macabre with it.
Sickness.
Sickness.
Sorrow.
Sorrow. Yeah. Mourning. Image is called Fading Away by a guy named Henry Peach Robinson about the same time. The interesting about this image is that it purports to depict not death, not life, but that moment of a transition moment when the soul has exited the body. Photographs at that time, you would go get your photograph made, and we call it you get your photograph impression made. And not impression in terms of impressionism, but that something in you would impress itself upon the medium, the plate, the glass, the whatever. That something here is touching something there. This idea of photographing the last, could you capture that on film? What do you capture? I think it's also interesting to always consider about when we talk about photography, these words that you capture an image, that you shoot a photograph, you take a picture, that they are like not to be like that, but like, almost kind of like aggressive terms. Like it's a one-way thing. This image, I probably don't need to tell you, is also a photocomposite. Every single individual character photographed separately and reassembled in the dark. This is a way of trying to depict the most delicate of moments. And he couldn't do it as the way he wanted, so he built it the way he wanted. So he manifested it the way that he wanted. Oh, we're finally here. We're not even halfway there either. Sorry, guys. I'm done looking at your watch. The first known person to photograph a spirit, again, was Richard Orsnell in 1851. I think this is so interesting to consider. Those two images by Rylander and Robinson were about 58, 57. Fox Sisters, 1848. So this is like right at that same time. What's cool about this is that, and this is the image, obviously, is that this guy was derided not for anything spiritual because, like, you're a poor operator. That's called a blur, and we all know what that is. You're not fooling anyone. You are silly. And he apparently was so dejected, it was a bigger offense to be called a poor operator. He gave up photography for a while, but actually came back a couple decades later and did some of the most interesting spirit photographs. There are so many phenomenal artists out there, and I use that word purposely, who are creating these amazing depictions of the afterlife. But Richard Orsnell, when you get home, get on your Google and look at his images because they're really, really interesting. But the man of the hour, William H. Mumler, a Boston boy. Kind of incredible. He was a brilliant man. Actually, let's see my name. He was really a brilliant man who held more than 4 patents, including something that's still called the Mumler method, which is allowing people to transfer illustrations onto emulsion plates, basically for newspaper printing. He was an engraver by trade. He was somebody who was like practicing all these different ideas. Again, this photo electrotyping process. Like he was trying a lot of different things. They actually don't know where he was born, but we kind of always just say he's from Boston. So, just thinking about where we're at. We're in the 1860s right now. So we're about 22 years post birth of spiritualism. Rylander, Henry Peach Robinson, and countless others are in art and salon circles presenting these images. People are starting to really turn into spiritualism as a movement. Of course, in the 1840s and 50s, it was unique, it was a novelty. But really, by the 60s, right around the time of the Civil War, things started getting really, really legitimate with the spiritualists. Because, of course, I can't talk to a loved one because they are away somewhere. Maybe I can communicate with them. I don't know if my son is dead, but maybe I can try to do it this method. So things were galvanizing in place. People at this time, even by the 1860s, has kind of moved from just a simple Fox Sisters knocks to doing what were called physical manifestations, everything from table tipping to incredible like ectoplasmic shows and these amazing things with people like these trumpets and all this kind of stuff flying in the air became bigger and bigger and bigger. At the time before movie stars, in the same way that we think about it, you could make a lot of money being a traveling magician or a spiritualist and all this. They had these people who did entire orchestras of spiritualist instruments playing, and they would supposedly float around in the air. Ooh, that was kind of Boston was a hotbed of spiritualist activity. It is, as now, kind of a sister city to New York, where New York would be so much more industry, where Boston has always been known for so much of the education. So you could kind of come here to cut your teeth at that time to be around all the great colleges, and you're like, I'm a legit thing, I'm real. So the Fox Sisters came here, obviously Mumler was here. Anyone who was sort of major would kind of get their cred in Boston, especially spiritualists. There's a lot of very famous groups here. In fact, the first brick and mortar spiritualist building right here on Newberry Street. Not here, but Boston. You can go see it today. It still stands. It is the first permanent structure to spiritualist temple. The scale is massive, and right now it is also home to the most scary thing: a Joe's Bar and Grill. But it really is cool. I mean, it's kind of neat to be able to see that. So, but back to Mumler. So Mumler, in 1861, he is renting a studio space, 285 Washington Street in Boston. And he is trying all sorts of different things. He's playing around with his camera, and supposedly, at this time, he is playing with self-portraits. And he gets this one image, this is the image, of this young girl, this figure, who is standing or sitting next to him. He shows certain people, supposedly got verified by a man from Cambridge, to come look at it. Like, sure enough, this can't be a trick of photography. This has to be real. And thus, in that moment, just like the Foxers, so they weren't really the first, Mumler ushered in an entire new way of thinking about the confluence of photography and spiritualism. It gave the facet of proof. All these ideas, all these feelings I have, I can see them manifest down in front of me. And when you think about something as kind of, I just love these backgrounds. If you guys, you look for them on eBay, they're highly, very, very expensive. But if you find one, just give it to me. I'll take care of it before you tell me about it. But you actually, I kind of love this. You can still look up. There's this fantastic website, by the way, called Chronicling America, and you can look at all the old newspapers. So you just type in Mumler, you type in Houdini, you type in whoever you want to look at. You can see almost every single listing of currently archived newspapers. Really cool. So you can find his early things talking about himself as an engraver. He's like fantastic, which actually here's an authentic one I also found on eBay, honestly. These kind of people depicting like what Mumler was doing, and I love this idea that result, portrait of Dodd with his 5 deceased wives in spiritual, which is kind of funny. I think one other thing to notice about these images, which I have some like reproductions here, gosh, I wish they were real, is something about the scale of them. So they are actually this size. So these are called carte de visites, visiting cards. These were wildly important and wildly popular. This type of thing was one portion a business card, one portion a calling card, and one portion like your very best Instagram photo. You would, if you were going to a party, they would have baskets, and you would, to make sure you were there, you'd throw in your little carte de visite, your visiting card as you're there, so people could see who was there. And of course, you had your very best friends. You put them in a little booklet here and put them over there and do all that kind of cool stuff. But this idea of like the tradability of this, and this interesting thing too that kind of keeps me up at night is that you would have this book where you would put your faces of friends in. It always is so interesting, this idea, but we still want to do it now. If you think we are any different from anyone else, like, you're so wrong. Like, that is something that comes up time and time again with spiritualism, spirit photography, and all this, that, like, people were dumber back then. People didn't get it. No, they got it. We are the exact same people. The same way that I know whoever this beautiful lady is, like, that's her best day. Like, I know that's how your Instagram photos are, too. Like, they are these curated selves. But we like to collect them and keep them and do stuff with them. And I also think it's kind of interesting too, whenever you consider like the relative size and like shape of all this stuff, that it's like we can't get away from these rectangles of things. But I don't know. But Mumler. So Mumler is doing this stuff in the 1860s at this point. He's on 285 Washington Street, which right now is kind of like a dump. You really can't see anything there. But he is kind of starting to get popular, starting to get more well known. And I will say one interesting thing about him, which is another story we go on all night about, is the influence of important women, not only in his work, but who supported his work. In fact, the person he was renting a photographic studio for was an incredible woman named H.F. Stewart, who he was renting space from. Now, his soon-to-be wife, oddly enough, H.F., her name is Hannah, Green, was a secretary at the space for Mumbler, who supposedly was the first one who Mumbler showed this photograph to and said, like, I think there's something here. And she was a spiritualist and a medium and like said, yes, I think there's something there too. And it was really through their partnership that Mumbler became who he was. Because now he had this and she had that. And together they could do that or whatever. That's a bad metaphor. You know what I'm trying to say? This idea that she led the legitimacy to his photography led the legitimacy to her mediumship. It was a really bi-directional thing. And so this is actually her card. And it's so cool to think about. So that's the reverse of that card. And I just love to see her depicted as this kind of giant cross on her neck and this Pope-like figure on her, kind of giving her this direction. But it's a really interesting thing. I guess I'm just saying enough that like this partnership is what made Mumbler kind of who he was. And that's a story that's just not told enough. I think it should be told. Interesting to note too, prior to meeting Mumbler, Hannah was a hair wreath maker, turner. She'd create morning lockets. I see a lot of nodding heads, so you'll know what this is. This is a beautiful form of remembrance where you would take care of the deceased or sometimes living and create these highly, highly intricate designs. They're extremely collectible right now. You really should see some so cool. So she was kind of in the mourning business before she got into the mediumship business. That's something that's going to come back, this connection between mourning and spiritualism, mourning and spirit photography, mourning and photography. This idea of photography as something that stops the dead from dying. Something. I mean, what do you do with the information that the photographs you took today will outlive you by far? That they exist as Facebook's property, whether it's Instagram or not. And there will be someone 100 years from now who will flick through every single one of your photos you took today that you posted, I guess. They will see real time your faces. They will see all that stuff. That you will be a fantasy, and that sounds creepy, but I mean, like, you will be someone whose face someone looks at and says, I wonder who they were. I wonder what they were doing. Just like we're doing with this. I love some of the compositions too. I mean, for the art lovers in the room, this is like really kind of bizarre rule of thirds stuff. It's just not these perfect portraits. Now, Mumbler was doing something really interesting at this time where he was charging $10 per portrait. Like something about $300 in today's money. And he would sometimes ask the person to come back more than once. And of course, if you didn't get a good spirit photograph, you have to come back and pay again. And sometimes he would shake his hand over the camera and make something happen, and sometimes he would sit in the back. But there was always this idea of his wife at the time being intrinsic to helping the spirit manifest. He would also request that you bring in, sometimes a days beforehand, a picture of your loved one who you want to have photographed. Sometimes, kind of like some psychics do, they will ask you a whole lot of questions and say, oh, so you're your brother and you only have one arm, okay, like, and sort of kind of like take some of this information, and the photograph would show up and the ghost only has one arm. How amazing is that? And like, so there were like these techniques that were done. Some of them more crude than others. Again, I want you to go back. This is probably 1862 at this point. We are 4 years after Rylander and his 32-plate Two Ways of Life. This is not like, no one is looking at this like, oh my God, how they do it. They knew then like we know now. But going back to that kind of the Millerism and the Second Great Awakening and all this idea of a reaction against rationalism. The proponent for belief. It doesn't matter. I mean, what's that fantastic quote, right? Like, seeing isn't believing, it's the other way around. I always think about that. So in 1863, Mumbler kind of gets one of his first main opponents. He is the leader of one of the spiritualist temples out here who says what we all think, which is like, these are not only fake, they're really bad. And you're making us look bad, guy. Like, I think we are trying to bring legitimacy to this, because I cannot underscore that spiritualism was not a fringe belief. Some would say millions, of people were active spiritualists during that time. Some would say as few as 50,000, but who knows? I mean, the reality is a massive, massive system was happening. I'll point to this image one last time. I haven't pointed this yet, so I'll say it to myself, I guess. This is another image by Rylander. This image is called Hard Times. If someone had guessed a narrative to this image, could you guess it?
Depression.
Yeah, right? This guy who's worrying. He's worrying about the life that he could have. He sees a happy wife and a happy kid around here, and there's, obviously not happy or sick or tired or something. This idea of he either wants that or had that. But I am depicting a thought now in this tangible form, in an artistic form, in the same photograph. The connection with Mumler is just so important. Now, Mumler did not present himself as only the strict portrait photographer. He made many of these kind of joke photographs. These are 1865, post-war and all that. But he was well known to basically make photo illustrations. I say this only to implant to you what you already know, which is this technological ability was not unknown to him of how to do this stuff. I think about the other major elephant in the room in the 1860s, which is, of course, the Civil War. We saw what death looked like somewhere else. I think in some ways at that point, though, there was obviously public executions and all that kind of stuff, obviously there were. But the death that you knew would have been the loved one's death. There would have been the death that you could see with your own eyes and doesn't get to go anymore. Now I'm seeing reference of dead people hundreds, if not thousands of miles away. And I see what they look like now. And I see what the brutality looks like. I see images that I don't want to see. I think about in the history of photography what's predating this image. Of course, we know that prior to photography, the main form of depiction would have been painting or illustration. And in the paintings or illustrations of war, they would have been noble. You would have seen men on steeds and flashing sabers and all this. And here I'm seeing kids in ditches dead. That sucks. That is really hard to kind of wrap our heads around these images that came back. And these were, oddly enough, presented in galleries. I know that there have been many different cults of death that have happened to, or fascinations with the deaths, but these looked different because they were relatable. It's going back to what we said earlier. I'd almost rather see a dancing devil than my dead neighbor. There's just something kind of different about that. And I think of this image a lot. And this image and series of images sticks with me. Does anyone recognize it?
Surratt's hanging.
Yes. The hanging of the Lincoln Conspirators in 1865. So obviously post-Lincoln assassination, they round up the known conspirators at the time. And that you brought up Surratt, Mary Surratt, who was the mother of one of the conspirators, who, and you probably may know more than I, so please correct me, but who really had no direct connection with any sort of conspiracy. She would have housed them at some point. This idea that she was swept up in this punishment as we need to punish the mother, the source somehow has to be punished. And I love this image because, there's a series of them, and you see the dug graves at a certain point. You see them before they're on the gallows. You see them here. And I think there's this complicated, delicate, horrible, beautiful thing happening where it's a hot July day when this happens. Marie Surratt is being shielded with an umbrella so she doesn't overheat. A moment before her death. This strange dignity that was given to them. And of course, within moments. Now, why this image sticks with me, the same exact reason why the images of the Civil War stick with me, is that this was a private execution. Only people who were invited to be there inside of this fort to see this. So you think about public executions, which would have happened, it would have been massive crowds of people who would have seen them. But those that saw them, they had their mental image and then went home. They let the photographer Alexander Gardner come in here to photograph this. And now infinitely more people have witnessed this death than could have ever done it in person. This death, as crazy as this phrasing I'm about to say is immortal right now. I'm watching live, dead, live, dead. What do we do with it? And I come back to the same question I just asked, like, what do we do with the information? We look at this Gabby Petito thing that just happened. I know there's a lot of issues going around with race, of course, understandably. But I think the story is so fascinating because we have almost like minute per minute documentation until it happened. It's easier to believe, to imagine what could have happened than to see it. And it's just like, this is more brutal and more scary. I digress. Back to spirit photography. Mumler ended up leaving Boston in 1863. That spiritualist leader who kind of came after him really damaged his reputation here, so he went to New York. And literally upon arriving to New York, he didn't take long, he ended up getting his own photo studio. The mayor of New York sent an undercover chief to kind of come do some testing on him. So he sent the guy $10, said, come get my spirit photograph, and like, cool. Did it, got the photograph, got some pamphlets. This chief took her, goes back to the station, literally indicts him. Like right then and there, like, you are a fake, you are a fraud, we're bringing you to trial. And one of these star witnesses is, of course, P.T. Barnum. P.T. Barnum, the so-called prince of humbugs. And I feel like because of Charles Dickens, we all think of humbug as like kind of a bad thing. But humbug means fake. And he gleamed himself as prince of humbugs, like, I am the king of fakes. And in fact, also, I keep bringing this date of 1865, it just so happens, he first wrote this book called Humbugs of the World, where he just went down the line and said, that's fake, that's fake, that's fake, that's fake. He called out the Fox sisters. He even challenged Maggie Fox directly to a $500 challenge. Prove to me spirituality is real. Prove to me this stuff is happening. He called out Mumler in this book. He was long going after Mumler. Supposedly, during the trial, it comes out that P.T. Barnum had correspondence with Mumler, and Barnum had been showing Mumler's photographs in his circuses. And supposedly has letters of Mumler saying, oh yes, totally fake, completely lie, you can have them all. Those letters mysteriously disappeared. Who knows what happened to them? And the trial is famous, and you can read all about it online. Go to this chroniclingamerica.com, type in Mumler. These newspapers here from 1869 are some of the depictions of it, which is kind of funny to see this front page newspaper about it. But you can read these stories about all kind of the positives and negatives, and supposedly the courts went through and had him reproduce these photographs in his studios and had scientists there. And as crazy as it sounds, could never prove any fake. They accused him of breaking and entering people's homes to steal their photographs of their loved ones so they could double and print them on plates and all, but never really could do it. Interestingly, I love this. I just had to read this for a second. The field's not all dead. So, a man by the name of William Mumler was arrested on a charge of swindling the public by professing to take photographic pictures of departed spirits. He claimed to be able to produce, with the portrait of a sitter, a likeness of any deceased friend. And this would be made to appear on the plate dimly indeed, as becometh a spirit, but easily recognized as the image of the dear departed. I guess, gosh, I would want to read all these, but they are so cool. I hope you can look them up. This is my favorite one. The fools are not all dead. Men and women with soft places in their heads will continue to run after the follies of this sort, and none of us will live to see the end of this and similar delusions. But we may do some service to the young and innocent by showing them that if judges and bankers are weak enough to believe in ghosts, there will always be mumblers to take their pictures. Love it. So it kind of goes on. But despite all this stuff, being acquitted of like a major crime, he kind of thought out he'd come out on top. The judge himself says, although he was morally convinced there had been trick and deception, the prosecution had failed to prove its case. And this idea of like a moral implication of what had happened, that he knew he was wrong, but he couldn't prove it. So Mumler, right after this trial in '69, gets railroaded out of New York, comes back to Boston to 170 West Springfield, still does exist, which is his mother-in-law's apartment. But he actually makes some of his most interesting photographs there. You can see, and of course I probably did what you guys would want to do. You can look it up, you can go there. Not too impressive, but it's amazing to think that he was walking those same exact streets, went up those very steps right there. But this is a time when Mumler was experimenting the most. He was kind of unfettered now from any true scrutiny. Those that believed him, those that didn't, like, got as far as we can get. But one of his kind of most famous, this is on eBay right now, I literally found this today. $199.99, $2,000 for that. No, I wouldn't pay it. I would pay it. I like this image a lot. This is of a Master Herod, who is from the Berkshires, and he was a young spiritualist medium, and you kind of have image 1 and image 2 of him in spiritual trance. So he was kind of hitting, I would say, his artistic stride while he was in West Springfield, or Springfield Street right now. Of course, his most famous photograph gets made there as well, which is, you tell me who this is? Todd Lincoln. So this is 1872 now. Well past the trial, well past, of course, Lincoln's death and all this kind of stuff. The story so goes that a woman came under the name of Mrs. Lindell, or Mrs. Tundell, to come see Mumler, and he took this photograph and said, Abraham Lincoln. Who knows if that's true? Doesn't matter. But this is definitely the image that put him on the map for forever. Mary Todd was a staunch spiritualist. The stories of her holding seances in the White House are very well documented. Spiritualism at the time was not just a belief among the poor. It was peddlers to presidents, quite literally, who believed it. We think about post-Civil War. This is like the nation is fractured and broken, but trying so hard to heal after this. And this idea of bringing back in this collective spiritualist ideations could somehow repair it. Mumler would, that's actually him at his older age, Mumler would not live much longer after this. He dies in 1884, not before writing a book in 1875. Kind of a self-aggrandizing autobiography, I guess we all do it. But he uses the story, which I don't even need to tell you the end of the story. He dies poor and destitute. Hannah leaves him, all this kind of crazy stuff. He's actually buried in Cambridge right now, to check it out. So is Hannah. He's actually buried under the name Mumler, even though her maiden name is Green. But the story, unfortunately, ends like as feverishly as it does. And here's a story I'll tell you too. You're not asking for it, but I'm going to tell you it anyway. The Foxers did the same way. They died alone, destitute, and poor. They were so poor, in fact, that when the first Foxer died, Kate, who was actually the younger one, they could not afford to put her anywhere. No one could afford to bury her. So they put her in a holding vault for about a year. I would say, fortuitously or not, her sister Maggie died a year later, and Kate had just been waiting. They got buried in a donated grave, and they're buried together right now in Brooklyn. When I say like the Fox sisters, Mumler, these stories, these are the sadly American tales. Chewed up, spit out, that's it. So, what happens contemporaneously with Mumler? What happens after Mumler? Are about 1,500 of the same stories. There are photographers across the world who are creating these, some with great acclaim, some with making millions of equivalent dollars at that time. And the images become more fantastic, more somber. They sort of move from this thing of being like, I feel like Mumler's images were manifestation, this idea that I was capturing a spirit, to I'm trying to document. I feel like there's a difference between like capturing and documenting. Like, what I look at right now is what we're going to go home and watch right after this. When we go from our ghost adventures, like, them chasing down orbs is the exact same DNA as this stuff. It's slightly different, but it's like, I'm trying to somehow see this thing that I don't know what it looks like. I mean, that's the thing that keeps you up at night as well, the 14 things I talked about. If you ever captured a ghost on film, would you even know what that looked like? What does a ghost look like? Is it an orb? Is it a flash of light? Is it a person in a very clear robe? Like, I don't think we know what that looks like. Some of them are exquisite. You can just spend all day typing spirit photography in Google and just take the day away. There are a lot of really incredible books. One is called The Perfect Medium, which is an exhibition put on by the Met in 2005. Some of the best documentation of spirit photography. There's an exhibition in 2018 at, I think it's also at the Met, oddly enough, called Imponderable, where you see some of the cool, like the cotton leaf fairies and all this. So some really excellent book. This stuff is highly documented right now. And interestingly, like, it's highly collectible. I have, which we can look at afterwards, I have some like really fantastic kind of early examples. One of my prized possessions is, there's a Mary Todd by Mumler, but even though he put his name on it, obviously he didn't take his photograph, she was far too young at that time. But he was making his money doing what all these people do, which is like crank out reproductions of things. So the story continues, and like I said, the images continue to be made. People are still making plenty of money off them right now. They really move into the realm of like stereo viewers, which I have some examples up here. So these 3D things. Don't forget, like, moving cinema is happening at the same time, which is the exact same technology. So they start to become horror movies. They start to become these kind of cool stories. You guys probably know what phantasmagoria are, which is something that happened prior to photography. Basically like gelatin slides, you can fly around a room and all that. I just showed this back of this one, because if you see this name here, Miss Hutton, Georgiana Hutton, is a highly, look her up, she's a really, really incredible spiritualist artist who's supposedly guided by the hand of the spirit to paint these bizarre abstract paintings. I just thought that was really neat. But again, this notion of this thing didn't end or didn't stop, it's still happening today, it's going to happen on TV tonight. But I did want to bring up, as we're kind of rounding out this idea, and I know I spent a lot of time on Mumler, because his story is unfortunately emblematic, I think, of all the stories of the famous spirit photographies at the time. There were people who were going through, able to like see this wave, to believe it or not, make a bunch of money, get claimed to be a fraud, move on to something else. It's a very similar story. In fact, in 1888, our beloved Fox sisters wrote a tell-all about this whole thing's been a hoax to begin with. And if you think about like Manson in the 60s and Woodstock and all that kind of stuff as like this death of the 60s culture, 1888 was the death of spiritualism. Mumler was dead, the Fox sisters were dead, everything had just kind of like, those big heavy hitters had left us. Round one was through. Round two comes up there. This is a whole other night, guys. Let's come back here tomorrow and say last Boston person I'm going to tell you about, Mina Crandall. So she was working now more like the teens in Boston. And she was doing these crazy physical manifestations. You can see here like a ghost hand coming out from between her legs. They were highly sexual. This ectoplasm, this white fluids are kind of going places and all these things that are groping and touching and skin-like that you could interact with. Was doing these seances all across Boston. I mean, you can find these locations. She was married to a Boston social worker, and herself as well. I'm not going to tell you the whole story. I want you so bad. Just like the Fox sisters and Mumler coming up against Barnum, we all know Houdini hated spiritualists. His big feud with Arthur Conan Doyle. You probably also know that Houdini himself was this practicing musician. He was a fake spiritualist, fake spirit photographer for a little bit of time. Like, he knew it, he knew the tricks, he thought it was ridiculous. And he did the same exact thing that Barnum did, which he thought this is all fake. As opposed to Barnum's $500 reward, Houdini offers $10,000 for anyone who can prove the existence, without a doubt, of the afterlife, ghosts, spirits, or anything. A prize that is still unclaimed today. There's actually, he like really did try to do like this spiritualist duel with Mina, Marjorie Crandall. That's her right there, that's him of course. You guys also probably know when you get home, for those who are visiting, look up Houdini in Salem, because he kind of had a cool thing here too. He went so far as to create his own spirit photography, just to again like rub it in the nose, just like Barnum, like this is so fake. Now, where am I going with all this? We're almost there. Where do I think, what do I think spirit photography is? Is it a novelty? Is it a game? Is it something to trick stupid people out of their money? These idiots who didn't understand technology. Or is it something closer to this? Another thing I'd love to hang out with you guys and talk about, the other Victorian practice, which I think is a twin to spirit photography, is postmortem photography. This idea of capturing your late loved one's image, visage, on a plate. I mentioned before about what the photographic impression being made. That somehow that the light that touches this person touches that plate, and I'm holding on to it now. I have a physical record of this person. Death, as we know from the images of the Civil War, everywhere, is ugly, it's brutal. I think death was something that anyone at that time would have had a very close acquaintance with. We all know the ideas of the funeral parlor and the idea of the home parlor being turned into the living room as a direct reaction to that kind of stuff. And so this idea of like what happens when death can become more beautiful and it doesn't have to be as disgusting. What happens when I'm being invited by a person, Mumler, Hutton, whoever, Mina Crandall, say, come talk to me about your grandma. Come talk to me about your son. What are they like? Imagine them. Imagine if they could be here with you right now. These images, without hitting it too far over the head, in my mind, they're memorial images. I think by far, every single person, probably not every single person, most people there didn't think that they were getting their picture of a tangible ghost. But they wanted a beautiful scene. They wanted a validation of a memory. They wanted this idea to be able to come through and feel in a way that was maybe prettier than it actually looked. This to me says it all. When you have one opportunity to photograph a loved one, which one's a little bit better to look at? A partially decomposed child or the one child who's happy right next to you? Spirit photography, in my mind, are icons of the bereaved. They don't represent. But you know what? I'm going to read you a quote. Should always end on a quote, right? This is by a guy named Martin Jolly, who wrote a book called Faces of the Living Dead. And he says, historians, curators, and artists have realized that although fakes on one level, spirit photography nonetheless remains powerful photographic evidence on another. They speak to us more strongly of faith, desire, loss, and love than of gullibility. Looking at the portraits now, their fakery seems crude and self-evident, but if we keep on looking, another very real quality emerges from the faces of the people who were photographed. Their ardent desire to see and to touch a lost loved one once more. And that's what I got for you tonight. Thank you all very much.